Hello. Billy Graham once said that we become a neighborhood without becoming a brotherhood. Listen to the message in this song, our love for this great country.
Skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains, majesty above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Sing it with me if you want to. Spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains, majesty above the fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. America,
anyone who doesn't have goosebumps right now doesn't have red blood in their body. That was fantastic. Thank you, Wintley Phipps. Welcome to a very special evening of political renewal. My name is Nick Penniman, and I'm the president and CEO of Issue One. I helped found Issue One 3.5 years ago for the purpose of creating a cross-partisan coalition to fix our broken political system. In the last few years, we've recruited nearly 200 former members of Congress to join us in that quest, and also some governors too, some of whom you're going to meet tonight. We are also have recently been supportive of a caucus that's opened on the House side. It has 26 members, bipartisan caucus in the House, to accomplish a similar goal. The former members of Congress who have joined us here today, and you can see many of them sitting here, we've got 54 former members of Congress with us tonight, folks. They are here for the same reason that you are here, to return to the source, to reconnect with what was set in motion in this town more than 240 years ago. There are all kinds of reasons people and communities return to the source. Sometimes it's to see how far they've traveled. Sometimes it's because they've lost their way. Sometimes it's because they've forgotten the common thread that held them together. Sometimes it's to seek new inspiration from old storylines. We are here tonight for all of those reasons. We are here to remember and discuss the first right that we granted ourselves as Americans. The first right. Now, normally when you ask people about what the founding rights of America are, they immediately jump to the most famous words in the Declaration of Independence, the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But it's the sentence after that which is even more important, because it talks about how we achieve those rights. What, after all, is the point of a destination if you have no idea how to get there? So here's that sentence that follows the most famous sentence, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it. You see, it is the instituting of government that is our first right. It's our right to govern ourselves. And when, as is the case today, our political system is breaking down and our ability to self-govern is hobbled, then all of the other things that we care about breaks down too. We at Issue 1 have crafted our own declaration for tonight. It's called appropriately a declaration to renew the Founders' Promise. It's been signed by nearly 200 former members of Congress and governors. Let me read a little bit from it. Quote, powerful factions manipulate the legislative process for their own narrow advantage. Our elected officials devote a disproportionate amount of time to political fundraising, marginalizing the voices of regular citizens. Outside groups spend hundreds of millions of dollars vilifying and denigrating members of the opposite party. Too often, undue influence and partisan politics, rather than merit and evidence, dominate policymaking. We, the people, have no choice but to urgently confront the cynical defenders of the status quo and alter our system. It continues, I quote, we must champion a new wave of leaders who bridge divides and place country above party. Demand that Congress remake the relationship between money and influence, incentivizing the participation of everyday citizens in the process. Insist on an honest and transparent political system that defends against foreign interference and allows citizens to hold their elected officials accountable to the highest ethical standards. It also asserts, quote, in a functioning democracy, power resides with the people. So too does a duty to repair and strengthen our system rest with each generation and with every citizen. A duty. A duty to repair the system. Just as the sentence after life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is often overlooked, so is the vital yet tedious and arduous duty to repair the system when it's broken. How many times have you heard talk in a presidential debate or a Senate debate or a congressional debate about fixing the broken system? Never. Never in my lifetime. How many times have you picked up a newspaper and read that a bunch of philanthropists are gathering together and pumping $100 million or more into a cause or an effort to fix the broken political system? Doesn't happen. But we do that to cure diseases and to eradicate diseases in foreign countries. But it is that purpose that creating a functional government that is so necessary, because getting the government working again is how we can solve problems at scale. And when the government isn't working, no amount of philanthropic dollars, no amount of citizen action is good enough to create the solutions necessary to really solve the challenges we face. Our motto at Issue 1 expresses this imperative well. It's called Fix Democracy First. It's the tagline. It's right on our website if you look at just below our logo. What's the first thing that a pilot does before boarding the plane? He or she walks around the plane to check the equipment. What's the first thing a cook does before actually cooking? Well, they set up the kitchen. They make sure that it's set up logically and efficiently for them. What's the first thing an athlete does before they go out on the field or out on the court? They check their equipment. They stretch. The first thing we now all must do together is get our democratic republic working again so that our highest hopes and dreams have a better chance of becoming a reality. In fact, this is not just our duty, but it is our universal duty as Americans to always prove that democracy works and uplifts, and to continually show that authoritarianism in all of its forms is destructive to the human soul. This universal duty was baked in at our birth. Just think of the great line Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense. And by the way, maybe some of you know this, but when Common Sense was in circulation, it actually outsold the Bible. It sold more copies than the Bible in the lead up to the Revolutionary War. Here's what Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense, quote, "The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. Many circumstances have and will arise which are not local but universal, and through which the principles of all lovers of mankind are affected." We need to look no further for proof of how Americans naturally assume this duty than a survey that came out back in November. It was conducted by the American Psychological Association. Twice a year, they query citizens about the main causes of personal stress in their lives. Personal stress, not what do you think the country's biggest problems are. We're creating personal stress in your life. So here they were. Number one personal stressor in people's lives, the future of the nation. Number 2, jobs, meaning, the economy. Number 3, work, meaning personal stuff at work. Number 4, the current political climate. So number 1 and number 4, causing personal stress in people's lives. Tip O'Neill might have coined the phrase that all politics is local, but what we see now is that politics is personal for people today. It is personal for people. And that's why we're so excited to be here with you tonight. This is our moment, we believe. We think that we're at an historic inflection point. This is probably the most teachable moment that I've ever seen in my lifetime, to actually grab the imaginations of Americans and have a conversation with them about how to restore and fix our political system. We in this room are Republicans and independents and Democrats. We are young and we are old. Some here are first-generation Americans, and some have come from families that have been here for more than 300 years. But we are all, not just tonight, but forever, sons and daughters of the American Revolution. We are the offspring of this remarkable experiment in creating and maintaining the world's first true democratic republic. And we are ready to launch a new revolution to fix our political system. So thank you all for coming tonight to be a part of this conversation. And now I am personally honored to hand the microphone over to Jeffrey Rosen, who is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center and our co-host for the evening. Jeffrey.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the National Constitution Center. This hallowed space was created by the U.S. Congress during the bicentennial of the Constitution to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people. And just steps from this theater is a gallery with the 5 rarest drafts of the U.S. Constitution, written by James Wilson. And Wilson's very first draft contained no preamble. It simply said, "Resolved, the government of the United States shall consist of an executive, legislative, and judicial branch." Wilson's second draft, a few weeks later, said, "We the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Providence plantations," and so forth, "do ordain and establish this government." It wasn't until the third draft that the convention used the immortal words, "We the people of the United States." And the reason they made that change was to signal their belief that we, the national people, are sovereign, and we are endowed by our Creator, each of us as individuals, with the unalienable rights that Nick read in the Declaration of complete freedom of conscience, of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And whenever government threatens those rights, it's our right and duty to alter and abolish it. Now, from the beginning, the framers are centrally concerned with the problem we're going to talk about tonight with America's greatest historians and some of our most distinguished political figures, and that is the problem of faction. James Madison is extraordinarily concerned about faction. He looks at democracies like Greece and Rome and sees that they led to demagogues and the mob. Madison says in Federalist 58, even if every Athenian had been Socrates, Athens would still have been a mob. And that's because he believed that direct democracies ruled by passion rather than reason Only the extended Republic of America would slow down deliberation so that people could educate themselves, listen to arguments on all sides, and be governed not by passion, but by reason. And that was Madison's hope. Today, as we all know, new technologies of social media are balkanizing America into echo chambers and filter bubbles and making it harder and harder to hear from different points of view. As a result, the factions that Madison feared are rampant, and any hope of common conversation is elusive. The National Constitution Center exists to host these conversations. That's why I was excited when Nick reached out. Although the National Constitution Center can't endorse any particular result of these deliberations, we are honored to convene this extraordinary group of historians and political figures to talk together about how to revive the Founders' Promise. And remember that Madison's key belief that the key to the success of the American experiment was education. Education in the fundamentals of the Constitution was not some elusive and ambiguous goal. Madison thought, unless each of you exercised, and I'll use the word Nick just did, your duty to educate yourselves about the Constitution, then you, as individuals and we together, could not be self-governing citizens governed by reason rather than passion. So that's what we're gathered here tonight in this consecrated place to educate ourselves, and we have some of America's greatest thought leaders to help us do that, and I'm going to turn the mic over to them. Thank you so much.
Good evening. You got to get more excited than that. We got these great historians coming out here. Good evening. Good evening. I am thrilled and honored to be in the city of miracles. A miracle, Super Bowl champs, the Philadelphia Eagles. A second-string quarterback wins the Super Bowl. A miracle, one of the miracles that still gets me tight in the throat. Benjamin Franklin, coming from Boston, helps build this city with his genius. And another miracle, our founders who created the Declaration, the Constitution, and a revolution, all within the confines of this great city. My name is Tim Romer. I am from the great state of Indiana, a former member of Congress. My co-chair, Zach Wamp, Connie Morella, have helped build this army of former members of Congress, the reformers of Issue 1, to try to take back our government so it goes back to our founders' dreams. A government that is only a government with the consent of the people. We, the people, run the government, not rich donors and wealthy people. We have common sense, bipartisan solutions. We are working with the states, 26 states, that are passing reforms to help parties and small donors and ethics and lobbying reforms. We're going up to Capitol Hill with the 191 former senators and congressmen to clean up our system. And we need your help. We need the American people's help. If children, if students across the country can change the debate on guns in our society, what can all of us do together to take back our government and clean up the money that is flooding through our systems, causing members of Congress to spend so much time dialing for dollars? When we went through the last presidential election, Senator Bernie Sanders said, when you have a corrupt political system, you have a corrupt economic system. Donald Trump, in a debate in 2015, said, and I quote, he said, all you people up on this stage, I gave you money. I got you to do whatever the hell I wanted. That's a broken system. Still, ladies and gentlemen, nothing has changed. We still have not drained the swamp. We still have not cleaned up the corruption. We need you. We need your help. We need your efforts as an army to take back our government. I'm hopeful, in the honor of introducing Joe Ellis tonight, that he's going to light the spark, provide the flame, maybe even the flamethrower to get all of you active in our efforts to do something about our broken system and money in politics. Joe and I go back probably to 2001 of June. He is a wonderful storyteller and writer. In fact, I think he's one of our best historians to tell the founders' story. First, he tells it like it is. He said when he was asked in one of his books, who are the 8 most profound leaders of our revolution? Who were the 8 key leaders? He said this: Abigail and John Adams, Burr, Franklin, Hamilton, Jefferson, Madison, and Washington. He had it right. Abigail Adams, not only as a wife and a partner, but a leader. And Joe Ellis called it as he saw it and gave her the credit she deserved. Secondly, Joe Ellis tells the music in the story of the American dream as well as anybody in history. 3 incredible events happened at the same time here in Philadelphia. We beat an army nobody gave us a chance to beat, the British. We came up with a radical document called the Declaration of Independence, condemning tyranny and kings, and we wrote a constitution creating our national government. Right here, if we can do those things together, we can take our government back. And lastly, Joe Ellis, he wrote this in Founding Brothers to show you what he thinks of the trade of being an historian. Quote, and he's quoting another author, he will row out over the great ocean of material and lower down a little bucket and bring it up to the light of day, some characteristics and specimens from the depths to be examined with careful curiosity. Joe Ellis examines everything with that careful curiosity, bringing up facts in our history from the depths to enlighten us, to engage us, and hopefully to inspire us to take our government back and get it back for the people. It gives me great pride to introduce a friend of mine to all of you in this miracle city of Philadelphia, Dr. Joseph Ellis.
God. I knew Tim when he was a member of the Congress representing Indiana, and I testified before his committee along with David McCulloch for a monument for John Adams and Abigail on the Mall. I thought I'd win over the family values people by suggesting John, Abigail, and little John Quincy trailing behind. It didn't work. I suggested that we build an Adams Memorial on the tidal basin at such a location that, depending on the time of day and the angle of the sun, Adams and Jefferson would take turns casting shadows over each other's facades. And I want to talk about the reason I think that's actually more than a joke, but it's also the conversation and dialogue that existed between them is what we need to recover. There is, the founders went back to the Greek and Roman classics, to Thucydides and to Tacitus, Suetonius, and Plutarch. The founders are our classics. They're the place for us to go back to when we're experiencing difficulty understanding the basic values governing our republic. I've got a limited amount of time, and I'm going to just tell you 2 stories. A story is the highest form of analysis, and the glory of it is everybody gets to decide for him or herself what it means. First story. It's the middle of September, 1787, about 2 blocks from here, and Benjamin Franklin's being carried back from the last session of the Constitutional Convention on a litter by 4 husky prisoners from the local Philadelphia jail. He's been carried to every session of the convention, and he makes every session, he's one of the few people that does, by these prisoners. He's given a speech earlier in the day that I urge you to look at. It's probably one of the most elegiac speeches he ever offers. He actually doesn't give it. James Wilson gives it for him because he can't get up to do it. But if you want a piece of literature on bipartisanship, check it out. A woman comes up to him, well-coiffed, Philadelphia damsel, and she says, "Mr. Franklin, what have you done?" And Franklin says, "We have given you a republic if you can keep it." Notice, he doesn't say we've given you a democracy. He says a republic. And to recover some of the meaning of that moment, up until then, according to Montesquieu, a republic could not exist in a nation as large as the United States. Republics were good for Greek city-states and Swiss cantons, but not for large nations like the United States. It's the reason why Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address says, remember that we are gathered here to see whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. So the republic as a viable model is unproven at that stage. Res publica, things of the public, public things. What's the difference between the public and the people? We the people. The public is the long-term interest of the people, which at any given moment, most of the people don't understand. A public servant is someone willing to lose an election in order to go in the direction necessary. How many people exist of that sort in the Congress of the United States right now? I'm sure there are some. There might even be some up there who have shared that fate. We're only about 100 million frontal lobotomies from a good answer on that, or a resolution. Second story. Adams and Jefferson are brought together by Benjamin Rush in 1812, not physically, but in a correspondence that begins, and they exchange 158 letters between 1812 and 1826. Adams actually writes more than twice as many as Jefferson. Jefferson's got other fish to fry, like building the University of Virginia. And they die, as many of you know, and this is the kind of thing no novelist could possibly make up, on July 4th, 1826. Jefferson dies at 12:12 in the afternoon, and his last words are, "Is it the 4th?" Jefferson's going to die on schedule, baby. And Adams dies at 4:35 in the afternoon in Quincy, and his last words are, "Thomas Jefferson still lives." Thinking of somebody else, and he's died, of course, just that day. The correspondence is the best window into the dialogue I'm trying to call our attention to. It's about aging, it's about the French Revolution, it's about new words. Adams says, what is this word, ideology? What does it mean, idiotism? The study of non compos mentis? Should we charge a tariff to allow this word into the vocabulary of the United States? But one of the central arguments they have is an argument that they would describe, they did describe, as an argument about the role of the few and the many. Actually, Jefferson would say the one, the few, and the many. That's an Aristotelian set of categories, okay? The one is the king, the few is the aristocracy, the many is everybody else, the peasantry. Adams says, you fear the one, I fear the few. Adams says, you and I ought not die before we have explained ourselves to each other. And they never completely do, but they explain enough for us to recover a fundamental difference. The founding is not a single set of propositions. The founding is a set of arguments. That's what the Constitution is, a framework to argue, not to provide answers, but to provide for a coherent set of arguments. And what we get with Adams and Jefferson is a really coherent argument about the relationship between the few and the many. Jefferson says, we've entered into a new world after America's birth. He's an Enlightenment creature and a bit of a utopian, more than a bit. We've come out of the cave. We no longer believe in miracles and witches. We've done away with primogeniture and entail. We're in a new world. And if in this new world, individuals are released to pursue their happiness as they see fit, the net result will be a robust economy in which wealth is reasonably evenly distributed. By the way, I know you're thinking this sounds like Adam Smith. That's not what Adam Smith says. It will be uneven, according to Smith. Adam says, well, that's an interesting argument, Thomas, but the truth is that you're making judgments about this America based on a very specific set of conditions obtaining now. Now, it so happens Tocqueville's going to come 6 years after they die and report that the distinguishing feature of democracy in America is equality of condition. There is a rough equality. Adams says that'll work for as long as we have a frontier and as long as we're an agrarian society. It's not going to work after that. And after that, what's going to happen? Yeah, we're all equal in terms of having equal rights, but we're not equal in terms of abilities and backgrounds, advantages, and it's going to be an aristocracy of wealth that's going to come to dominate the United States unless we do something about it. Adams predicts the Gilded Age. It arrives in the late 19th century and goes into the early 20th century. Mark Hanna, the Senate Majority Leader, Republican, is asked, what are the principles of politics as he understands it? He says there are two principles. One is money. I cannot remember what the others are. He also confronted with the fact that he corruptly supported a railroad company. Nothing is lost save honor. Adams was right, and what he is saying to us is that the underlying reason why we have a plutocracy now is that we have a very uneven distribution of wealth in the economy. Whenever the economy distributes wealth unevenly and really unevenly, you can be certain the people at the top will use their wealth to command control of the political system. That's what they did in the Gilded Age, and that's what they're doing right now. If you want to get rid of this, you got to figure out a way to make economic equality a reality and recover a robust middle class. We're going to have to give it a new name because the term New Deal doesn't work for a lot of people. But we understood this. The New Deal was, we let you corporations free to pursue profits in the marketplace. In return for that, we agree that you permit and encourage, we allow, no, not even permit, that you commit yourself to an equal distribution of wealth so that a robust middle class results. This is a compromise between capitalism and democracy. That is a promise that started to be broken in 1980 with Reagan. And there were other forces in play, globalization, but we now have greater levels of income inequality in the United States than any other advanced democracy in the world, and worse than the Gilded Age. The land that was famous as the land of the middle class no longer has a middle class. The system created by the founders that was described by Alfred Lord North Whitehead as, well, what he said was, there are two instances in his judgment in world history when the emerging elite of a major nation behaved about as well as anybody could hope for. One was Rome under Caesar Augustus, and the other was the United States under the founders. And we have screwed it up. That's a big chore. Two final thoughts to help us figure out how to resolve this. It's going to take a crisis. A recession won't do. There are lots of divisions here. Pursuit of happiness, does that have an economic dimension? Government, is that us or them? A lot of these questions. But I think that climate change will generate a crisis within the next 20 years that forces a view of government as us, because we won't have any choice. Let's get as much done between now and then as possible. By then, Mar-a-Lago will be underwater. But so will most of New Orleans. The second thing is, while this group is really important inside the tent group of people who are experienced in the political arena and are working as excellent reformers from within, we need an outside group too. We need people who are not going to run for office, who don't read the polls, who don't give a damn about what the public opinion is, who are going to take positions that need to be taken because they're right. In the same way the abolitionists prepared the way for Lincoln, in the same way that Martin Luther King would have never won an election in any district in America, and he paved the way for Lyndon Johnson and the civil rights. We need some people on the left who lead here. What do we want to call them? Progressives? I think we need to come up with a new word. That's up to you. But we need an outside as well as an inside game here. And when you are in the process of trying to make decisions, I want you to go back and look at what Franklin said at the end of the convention, read the Adams-Jefferson correspondence, and what you'll see is there is a group of people back there who believe that we are a collective. We are not a set of singular individuals. Washington, Franklin, Adams, young Madison, not older, John Marshall, all those people are collectivists. If you start talking that way, people are going to say you're a socialist. Before there was socialism, before Marx wrote a word, there was republicanism. That's what the founders are about, and we need to recover that. And if you go back, you'll find it. And as Casey Stengel so succinctly put it, you can look it up. Thank you.
I am Zach Wamp from Tennessee, and I have the privilege, and it is a privilege, to be the Republican co-chairman of the Reformers Caucus, which is now 191 members strong, almost equally divided between Republicans and Democrats. And I want to be a little transparent before I introduce our next very distinguished historian and author, and tell you really what my motivation is, what really kind of lights my fire at 60 years old. All of us now, many of you former members, and we're honored that you came, former governors, are a little later in our years. Kim and I are expecting our third grandchild, so anything I commit time to competes with that, and it's hard to compete with that. So what really excites me is it's a privilege when I was asked to come in and co-chair a caucus of 191 former members and governors, because nobody's ever done anything like that before. No one has ever put a group together like this to stand, and it's powerful. And it also excites me to have 26 sitting members of Congress, 13 Democrats and 13 Republicans, moving a legislative agenda of things that we know, if enacted, would restore confidence and trust in the United States government, which the American people deserve to have. And that excites me. But what really motivates me is I believe that the real change here is going to come generationally when young Americans are given an opportunity to govern and given the courage. The word encourage means to give courage. Given the courage to step out as young Americans to lead without drinking the Kool-Aid, to lead by putting their country above their party, to lead by standing on the Constitution, independently saying this is what's good for the country, not what's good for Republicans or Democrats or the next election. We are caught in this rut. In all fairness to my generation, we have presided over the unraveling. And in order to get things back on the right track, we need people from 25 to 45 to be recruited and elected. If they're in a red place as Republicans, a blue place Democrats, or I hope some are even independents, so that they can stay outside of the two-party blame game, which has now become institutionalized. And that fires me up, because I believe that has to happen. Or this experiment in whether or not people can govern themselves will actually fail. And I dread that thought, and I want my children to look up to public service, and I want their children to look up to public service, and that's what fires me up. Now, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is a Tennessean, and I'm a Tennessean. And I'm going to tell you a few things you may know about John Meacham, then I'm going to tell you a couple things that you don't know about John Meacham. You may know that in 2009, he won the Pulitzer Prize for writing American Lion, Andrew Jackson in the White House. You may know that he wrote Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, and it was on the New York Times #1 bestseller list. And then Franklin and Winston, An Intimate Portrait of an Epic Friendship, and it was also #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. Prolific author. He wrote American Gospel, the Founding Fathers, God and the Founding Fathers and the Making of a Nation, and almost overnight became kind of an expert on religion and politics, and I was stunned to see this young Tennessean speaking on matters of faith and government that I didn't even know he had researched so deeply. And then I read his latest book, Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush, and it's a great snapshot of a great American, Bush 41. But what you might not know is he married a girl from Mississippi. They had some young children, and he said, I want to raise this family in the South, and he moved from New York back to Nashville, where he lives today. You may not know that his new book, which comes out in about 6 weeks, is called The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. I have a hunch that book is about what draws us together here today. The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. And then finally, what I know you don't know about John Meacham is that after he graduated from the University of the South, Sewanee, his first job as a cub reporter was to cover my first congressional campaign against an 18-year incumbent, Congresswoman Marilyn Lloyd. And he was basically with me for 2 years everywhere I went except when I went home. I went home to get away from him. But he was the reporter that covered my race, and I barely lost, and she was a dignified, long-term Democrat who served with many of you, and she turned around, poor lady, in 1996, 2 years later, and endorsed me, a Republican, for re-election. And, of course, they treated her poorly, but that's exactly the relationship we had with each other, and John Meacham was a part of it. Y'all welcome my fellow Tennessean, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and presidential historian, John Meacham.
What Zach didn't tell you is that I was 14 when I was covering the race, but he was 17 when he was running. So I'm delighted. There may be one or two of you who don't know Sewanee very well. The University of the South is a little Episcopal school in the middle of the state. It's best understood as a combination of Downton Abbey and Deliverance kind of put together. So just keep that image in mind. I'm thrilled to be here. That was a very warm introduction. Whenever I think, yes, that's exactly right. I think someone's saying something nice about me, and it's absolutely correct. God, as he does, always humbles you. About 9 years ago now, I was on the Washington Mall at the National Book Festival, and I was walking to give my talk at that point about Andrew Jackson, and a woman ran up to me, which doesn't happen enough, or ever, actually. And she said, "Oh my God, it's you." And I said, "Well, yes, you know, it's existentially speaking, that's hard to argue with." Existential as an adverb is a Joe Ellis word. You know, we want to keep him happy. She said, "I just admire you so much, and I love your books, and will you wait right here? I just want to go buy it. Would you sign it for me?" I said, "Yes, ma'am." And I was standing there thinking, this is exactly the way the world is supposed to be. Hand to God, she brought back John Grisham's latest novel. So, whenever I think I have the world exactly where I want it, I remind myself that somewhere in America there's a woman with a forged copy of The Runaway Jury. Because what do? You have to sign it. So we're here for remarkable purposes. I salute all of you. I want to say, particularly to the people who served in public office, thank you. One of my many character flaws is I like politicians, even Zach, you know, going way back. And we have no other way to govern our public affairs, the public things of which Joe spoke. And so thank you for undertaking the sacrifice, putting your families through this. It's going to be okay, and it's going to be okay not least because of the work you do. It's also striking to me that so many of you understand the system as it is and could be profiting from it instead of trying to fix it. And I think that's a remarkable thing and should be pointed out, that you are undertaking to reform something that could accrue to your personal benefit. So thank you for that. So what I'd like to take our brief time today to talk about is 3 characteristics that I think we need, both in terms of the leadership of the country and, to use a term that Secretary Glickman used earlier, the followership of the country. I've written books about 5 men and God. What they all have in common is that those 5 men all thought they were God. It's Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson. That's not fair about President Bush. But I want to tell you quickly, for those of you who might be worried about him, you know, he's 93. He'll be 94 in June. Last March, a year ago today, March 15th, was Andrew Jackson's 250th birthday. I'm sure you all had a big party. We played paintball at my house. We had duels. And President Trump was coming down to lay a wreath at the grave of Jackson. And you may remember that for a while, President Trump was trying to associate himself with the Jacksonian legacy. It was not something he talked about during the campaign. I think it was pretty much an idea brought forward by the late Steve Bannon. So I'll wait, that's kind of funny. But he was trying to embrace Jackson. So he was coming down, and as Zach mentioned, I live in Nashville. So I was sitting there thinking, all right, I'm a Jackson biographer. I should probably say something about this. So I wrote the president an open letter. And it was basically, if you're going to embrace Jackson, don't just embrace the crazy. Embrace the fact that Jackson understood that he had vices, and he turned them into virtues. He was a brilliant negotiator, in part because everyone who came into his office worried he might shoot them. Not a bad tactic. And he was absolutely, for all his sins and all of the issues with him, he was absolutely devoted to the American Union. The idea that we were, as he once put it, one great family, and we had to stay in the same family in order to work through the problems and to become what we did become, which is a vast continental nation. We look at the map now and it all feels inevitable, doesn't it? It was not. And in 1832-33, when South Carolina was threatening to nullify federal laws, there was a question about whether we might break apart. And if we broke apart, I think our national story would have been much more like Europe or South America, Central America, than it has been the American story. So I wrote this letter saying, embrace all of us, try to use your vices as virtues. And the local newspaper ran it. It was the entire front page of the local paper in Nashville. It had no effect whatever, of course. But President Bush had been in the hospital most of last winter, and his staff had shown this to him. And so I was on my way into lunch the next day, and my phone rang, and it was George H.W. Bush. So I answered it. He said, "How you doing?" You know, the key to doing George H.W. Bush, by the way, is Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. You know, that's the end. He said, "How you doing?" I said, "I'm fine, Mr. President. How are you?" He said, "That's good." He said, "I read your letter to Jackson." And I thought, you know, the old boy's 93, right? He's been in the hospital. He can think I'm writing letters to Andrew Jackson, but what if he says that to the nurse or somebody? They're going to think he's losing it. So I said, "Thank you, sir. It's great to hear from you. But, you know, actually, it was a letter to Trump about Jackson." And without missing a beat, he said, "Yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention." So he's fine, if you're worried. So we find ourselves in this remarkable moment. And I want to talk a little bit about President Bush. He was the first co-chairman of this building, and it meant a lot to him, actually. And one of the things we have to have is empathy. And we often think of empathy as kind of a soft thing, sort of an Oprah thing, but it's not. And it's a virtue that Bush embodied. It was innate, really. He was known as half Bush as a child. He would cut candy bars in half, cookies in half, and give it to the other kid. But the best story about this is a story about someone you've never heard, named Bennett Mcnichol. Bennett Mcnichol was a classmate of George Herbert Walker Bush's at Greenwich Country Day School in the middle of the 1930s. And Bennett was a fairly rotund lad, as we would say. And George Bush was the best athlete in the school. And so what the faculty asked him to do in his last year was let the whole school run ahead of him. And then he would have sort of a handicap and go. Bush said, of course. However you would say, of course, at 14, of course. He takes off. He's going through a set of barrels on the ground. And he gets through and he looks over. And Bennett Mcnichol is stuck in a barrel. So the president grabs him, pulls him out, realizes it would be ungentlemanly to then defeat someone you've just helped. So he says, "Come on, we'll finish this together." Biggest moment of Bennett Mcnichol's life because he tied George Bush in the annual obstacle course race. Sweet story. Interestingly, I never heard it from a Bush. I heard it from a Mcnichol, who said it was something that he had lived with and told that story for 60 years. So sort of an amiable biographical anecdote. But there's a line between the man the teenager who pulled that boy out of the barrel, and also quickly, when I took the story to President Bush, I said, "I just heard the story about Bennett Mcnichol." And he said, "Bennett, he loved lunch." I said, "Not really the point, sir. He's still big, sir, not the point." But cut to November 1989. The Berlin Wall falls. George H.W. Bush is sitting in the Oval Office. He won't go to Berlin. I'm sure many of you were in Congress then. People in Congress, Dick Gephardt, George Mitchell, everybody was pounding on him to go to Berlin and declare a great victory in the long twilight struggle, as President Kennedy called it, of the Cold War. Bush won't do it. Why not? Because there was somebody stuck in a barrel, and that was Mikhail Gorbachev. And he knew that there was a hardcore right wing in Russia that did not want to see Soviet greatness go away, that did not want to see Russian greatness go away. And if you doubt me, I refer you to a young KGB officer named Vladimir Putin, who was part of that right wing. He won't do it. The boy who pulled that kid out of the barrel understood what he had to do. He put himself in the other guy's shoes. That is a human virtue that had a definitive effect on statecraft. One of the critical moments at the end of the Cold War. Didn't hear that line of analysis from Bush or from Jim Baker or from Brent Scowcroft. I heard it from Mikhail Gorbachev, who said that the two most significant moments for him, I actually interviewed him in Philadelphia years ago about this, that there were two moments. It was the Geneva summit with Reagan in '85 and the way George Bush handled the fall of the wall. Empathy. If leaders don't have it, and if followers don't have it, then the republic will not be kept. Because a republic is only as good as the sum of its parts. It's an idea from ancient Greece. It comes through the Renaissance, through Machiavelli, into the founding. We have to think about each other as best we can. And this is not a homily. It's not a 4th of July talk. We're not always going to do it. But just think, what if we did it once out of every 10 times? That's 100% improvement of how we're doing it now. Empathy. The second is curiosity, and this is a Jeffersonian characteristic, and I hesitate to talk about Jefferson in front of Joe. Joe actually knew Jefferson. Not since Joe Ellis dined alone has there been. I'll pay for that later. But when Jefferson sat down right over here in Jacob Graff's house to write the Declaration of Independence in late June of 1776, he was able to write what became the most important sentence in the English language, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Not simply because he was a bright young politician of Virginia, though he was. He was 33 years old when he wrote it. Jesus was also 33 when he did his best work. It's kind of a big year. When I turned 34, it was very depressing. I had not done any of that. He was able to write that sentence because he was in conversation with the broad sweep of what was going on in the Western world. His intellectual curiosity was brought to bear on statecraft. What had been going on? Gutenberg, the introduction of movable type, the scientific revolution, the rise of the bourgeoisie, Protestant Reformation, the translation of sacred scripture into the vernacular, an entire reorientation of the world from being organized vertically, whether popes and princes and prelates and kings, who either by an accident of birth or an incident of election had control over the destinies of others, was being turned into a horizontal understanding, where we were all born with the capacity and the right to determine that destiny. The American Revolution, the American experiment, unto this hour, is the political manifestation of that shift in understanding, that we can govern ourselves, and that we cannot allow others simply by virtue of heredity to do so, or of pre-existing position. Because Jefferson was curious, because he was familiar with the European Enlightenment, because he understood the Scottish moral enlightenment, he embodied that principle, and we continue to live into it. If we're not curious, we are not going to grow. We're not going to progress at all. We have to be empathetic. We have to be curious. And I think we have to be humble, and not simply in a Franciscan sense, though that's important. But we have to be humble enough to admit mistakes. We wouldn't be here if John Kennedy had not been able to admit a mistake. What he learned from the Bay of Pigs in April 1961 through the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962 saved all of us. He had totally screwed up the Bay of Pigs. And what did he do? He had the courage, and as you know, he wrote Profiles in Courage. As he once put it, there's a reason it's short and one volume. You know, there's not a lot out there. But he was able to have the courage to ask for help of the one person on the planet he least wanted to admit weakness in front of, and that was Dwight Eisenhower. He asked Eisenhower to come over. Eisenhower drove over from Gettysburg to Camp David. They had lunch at the presidential cabin. Kennedy said, "I don't know how I screwed this up." Eisenhower walked him through it. He realized that Kennedy had never had a full meeting where he heard the pros and cons in one place. He said that's absolutely essential. When Kennedy was shown photographic evidence that the Soviet Union was deploying offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba, 70 to 100 million Americans would have died in a hemispheric exchange. I think if there had been a hemispheric exchange, there would have been an intercontinental one. And I know that many of you, both because of your governmental career and because of your nonprofit work, believe that you have been part of the world's longest committee meeting. I know you think that. But the world's longest committee meeting was the Executive Committee of the National Security Council in 1962. He kept them in session for 13 days. And we came through that crisis not least because Jack Kennedy had the capacity to ask Eisenhower for help. He admitted a mistake and he learned from it. It's the hardest thing to do in the world. I make mistakes all the time. I hate admitting it. But we have to find a way to do that. I'll leave you with this. In the middle of World War II, E.B. White, the great essayist for The New Yorker, received a letter asking him to define democracy. And he wrote a talk of the town piece that said this. It was a favorite of FDR's. This is E.B. White. Democracy is the line that forms on the right. It's the don't in Don't Shove. It's the hole in the stuffed shirt through which the sawdust slowly trickles. It's the dent in the high hat. Democracy is the recurrent suspicion that more than half the people are right more than half the time. It's the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is a letter to the editor. God, is it? It's the score at the top of the ninth. It's an idea which hasn't been disproved yet, a song the words of which have not gone bad. It's the mustard on the hot dog and the cream in the rationed coffee. FDR ripped it out of the magazine, would read it to people who came into his office, and he would say, "Them's my sentiments exactly." I think they should be all our sentiments. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Meredith McGehee. I'm the Executive Director of Issue 1, and I work with Nick to lead the terrific staff of Issue 1. And I'm so pleased to see everyone here tonight. We're going to have a bipartisan conversation, and we're going to be taking that bipartisan conversation on the road to communities all across the country. So this is what's starting here tonight. I'm pleased to be able to introduce Marjorie Margolies. Marjorie is a 5-time Emmy Award-winning journalist who represented Pennsylvania's 13th District in the House of Representatives from 1993 to 1995. She is also the author of A Woman's Place, The Freshman Women Who Changed the Face of Congress. This followed the first 8 months after the election of the largest class of women ever elected to Congress. And here tonight, she is going to be moderating a bipartisan panel of Issue 1 reformers and, of course, our esteemed historians. Marjorie?
And Deval.
No? Great.
I'd like to introduce Sue Myrick, who from 1987 to 1991 was mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina. She was the first Republican woman to represent her state in the House of Representatives, where she served for 18 years. She is here tonight as a member of Issue 1's Reformers Caucus. Deval served as Massachusetts governor from 2007 to 2015, following a career in business and in law. He was Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, the nation's top civil rights post. He is the author of Faith. Do you want to sit?
Where do you want us?
Yeah. Where do I want you? Just sit right here. That works.
Interesting. Who didn't make it? Oh, here we go. Jeff's here. It's your house.
He's the author of Faith in the Dream, A Call to the Nation to Reclaim American Values. He is here with us tonight as a member of Issue 1's Reformers Caucus. Welcome. Welcome to our discussion about renewing the Founders' Promise. I want to set the stage for our conversation by reading an excerpt from a new declaration drafted by nearly 200 former members of Congress, governors, and cabinet secretaries, many of whom are in the audience tonight. The declaration states, as you have heard in some form, our system of government is failing to live up to the promise of America set forth by our founders. Our elected officials devote a disproportionate, a disproportionate amount of time to political fundraising, marginalizing the voices of regular citizens. Outside groups spend hundreds of millions of dollars vilifying and denigrating members of the opposite party. Joe, first question. I want to talk about this idea of a republic. You've written extensively about the founders, their philosophies, and how the country and this idea of representative democracy came to be. What are we talking about when we say the founders' promise? Who were the founders looking to for their ideas? And what concepts were they overturning by founding this company, this country?
Whoa. We teach courses on those questions here. Well, they gathered here in order to secede from the British Empire and establish the first nation-sized republic in modern history. Both of those things were major achievements. Many people thought it was impossible to defeat the British Army and Navy. I would say, in fact, the British Army and Navy never had a chance, any more than we did in Indochina or in Afghanistan. But that the promise of the founders is very much in the eye of the beholder. Different people here will see very different things in it. What I'm trying to say today as a focus of that promise is that there is a collectivistic vision of us as Americans. Not as blacks, not as whites, not as men, not as women, not as rich, not as poor, but as Americans. And that's the central message I think we need to send now. And that's back there. That's back there. And whoever does it explicitly will be accused from the right of being a socialist. And therefore, he can't or she can't run for office. But you need them to be making that case. And events, I mean, in the end, somebody, E.H. Carr said, the historian must be a person who has a sense of the future in he should say his or her bones. There's a crisis out there. And I think it's going to be climate change. And when that happens, everything that I'm saying will make perfect sense.
And will your grandchildren be?
I think I got 3 grandkids, and I'll tell them to go down and throw fishing rods into the lake where Mar-a-Lago is right now.
John, was your hand raised because you wanted to add something?
It is. My question, what I would argue, and what I hope would give everybody hope, because this feels like such a big thing to do, right? We're going to take care of money in politics. We're going to save the republic. What's for breakfast? It's a very difficult thing. But the promise Joe articulated actually wasn't fully fulfilled even in script until the 14th Amendment, right? Mm-hmm. So this is a journey toward a more perfect union, and it's not perfectible, and it's not going to be perfect, but it took us until Reconstruction to enshrine equal protection, and then in my native region, it has taken another century and more to act on that promise and provide equal protection. In the lifetime of a lot of people in this room, you could not register to vote in a lot of states that border my home if you couldn't tell a registrar for the 1/2 hour a month the registrar's office might be open, how many flakes of soap were in a box of detergent. That's in your lifetime. So hope is sustaining. Progress is possible.
One of the implications that it's difficult for people to understand now, especially college-age students when we teach them, the idea of a racially integrated society is a very new idea. It's a mid-20th century idea. None of the framers believed in it. Jefferson thought that blacks were permanently inferior. So that I talked about the conversation between Adams and Jefferson on the Tidal Basin, if they ever listen to where I say, there's a conversation among Jefferson, Lincoln, and Martin Luther King on the Mall. That's a very interesting conversation. And it has to do with what the phrase, "we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal," means, and what the pursuit of happiness means, and what we the people means. And it means different things. In 1787, when Governor Morris wrote in late August the words, "we the people," there were 4 million Americans and only 800,000 could vote. There are now 320 million, 200 million can vote.
And they don't.
And 100 of them, 100 million don't vote.
John.
Yet the real winner in the election is the 47% who don't vote.
John, let me ask you, what do you think our founding fathers would think about the state of our political system, especially the tribalism and the characterization of much of our politics today?
I think they'd look at us in the way we watch the Star Wars bar scene. It's sort of not comprehensible, right? I mean, as Joe says, they didn't have any idea. The forward-leaning abolition position as late as 1850 was recolonization. So the idea of a pluralistic, multicultural, diverse democracy, as opposed to a hierarchical republic, at least in terms of the power structures, is an incredibly new idea. And what I give them credit for is they enshrined the possibility for us to learn, for us to be curious, to learn, to adapt, to change. The fact that the document that Jeff takes care of was clearly set up to be amended is a sign of their essentially Enlightenment rationalist view. And so it's incomprehensible. I mean, the nuclear age is incomprehensible to them. The demographics of any public school system in this country would be incomprehensible to them. So, but what isn't incomprehensible was the idea that we would keep fighting for a stronger and free society. And one of the things that drives me crazy about the politics of the moment, particularly about building walls and tariffs, and we tried all this in the 20s, it didn't work out too well, is that as a practical matter, we have never been stronger than we are, and we've always gotten stronger the wider we've opened our arms. And I would just one final point. I think for those who are particularly depressed about the 45th president, one thing about the power of the changing country, it seems to me, one thing that is affirming about the growing diversity of the country is that if it weren't real, the backlash would not be so strong.
That's interesting.
Trump would not be president if this were not really happening.
In 2045, the whites become a racial minority. The closer we get to it, the more the backlash. But that means, as King said, the arc of the universe, the moral universe, tends towards justice, which is this phrase he borrowed from a 20th century, Theodore Parker in the 19th century. But that as things get better, the backlash will get stronger. Trump's a symptom of that. We'll see another version of that, and we should expect that.
Jeffrey, the other side of this conversation is the public and how they interact with our democracy. The opening line of the Constitution is, as we've heard over and over and over again, we the people. But today, poll after poll shows that Americans are simply not participating. They feel left out and they feel pushed aside. They stand in the shadows of billionaires and super PACs elbowing their way into our political system. The question is, how do you fulfill the promise of a democracy when the public, for the most part, no longer feels that its voice is being heard and that its voice matters?
You fulfill it through constitutional education. This was Jefferson's hope. He puts on his tombstone 3 accomplishments: author of the Declaration of the Virginia Declaration of Religious Freedom and founder of the University of Virginia. And this was Justice Brandeis's hope when, in the Whitney and California case, he channels Jefferson and says, the duty of men is to develop their faculties of reason. That was what Madison and Jefferson and the founders thought about when they created a republic that, as Joe Ellis said, didn't measure the momentary passions of the people, but their thoughtful deliberations over time. And the only way that you can thoughtfully deliberate over time is, first of all, to have a constitutional structure that doesn't allow for quick decisions, doesn't allow for Twitter polls or Brexit votes or initiative or referenda that can transform a constitution without the chance for second thoughts, which was the genius of the system, which is why it's working in that sense. And also, you have a citizenry that has the ability and opportunity to educate themselves thoughtfully. So when citizens are educated, they do have faith in institutions. And citizens who study the Constitution on both the left and the right are more likely to support an independent judiciary. Or the Bill of Rights. When Madison reluctantly supported the Bill of Rights, he didn't expect it would be enforced by judges. Remember how Madison changed his mind about the Bill of Rights? He initially said it was unnecessary or dangerous. Unnecessary because the Constitution itself was a Bill of Rights. Congress was given no power to suppress free speech, and therefore we didn't have to fear that it would. And dangerous because you might wrongly assume that if a right wasn't written down, it wasn't protected. And because our rights, Madison thought, come from God or nature and not from government, then they're too capacious to be reduced to a simple list. But he changed his mind, partly because of politics. He almost lost a Virginia House election because of anti-federalists. And he came to conclude that the Bill of Rights would be useful not because it would be enforced by judges, but because it would inspire citizens to respect it. Once citizens understood that speech was a natural right, then they would not support laws that illiberally infringed it. The Bill of Rights is an instrument of public education, and that's why teaching the Bill of Rights and teaching constitutional structures is so important, and that's why what Joe Ellis and John Meacham do in educating the public about the difference between a direct democracy and a republic is so important, and that's obviously why it's so important to convene people of different perspectives who don't ordinarily get out of their filter bubbles and echo chambers to experience the empathy that John so beautifully said is necessary for democracy. So that is what we need to do to create not laboratories of democracy in Brandeis's words, but enclaves of reason, spheres for public deliberation where people can exchange views and thoughtfully agree and disagree, and that's what the Constitution Center is for, and that's what Issue 1 is for, and that's why I'm so delighted that everyone is here this evening.
That was impressive.
Sue,
Jeff will have a coffee mug for everyone.
Absolutely, yes. For mere $9.95, yes.
Sue, you came into office during the Republican Revolution, and now you sit here, more than 2 decades later, really engaging some of the same questions. Do you feel our leaders are addressing the concerns of citizens, particularly when members of Congress frequently spend upwards of 30 hours, sometimes more, in a week raising money for re-election?
Well, I think most Americans feel that, you know, it's the government is not listening to them in any way. The representatives themselves work hard, and they go home and they meet with their constituents, and they, you know, take their concerns to heart. But as a whole, Congress doesn't hear them, and Americans are tuning out. And it really bothers me because I am so amazed at the number of people who will say to me, I don't watch the news, I don't pay any attention. And they say because they're so tired of the bickering and they're tired of the back and forth and the divisions, you know, and they want to see people working together. And it is hard on a member of Congress because you do spend just bukus of time raising money. And it's gotten to the point where, you know, the amounts keep going up. They keep asking more of members relative to what you have to do. And it's a lot of people are leaving just because of that. I mean, really and truly, they say, I'm just tired of it. I don't want to do it anymore because it does take a lot of time away. And the American people see that.
It's awful.
It's terrible. It's the worst it's ever been. Every year gets worse and worse and worse, in my opinion, just watching now from the outside. And it's got to be fixed because it's not right, first of all. And you shouldn't be spending so much of your time raising money instead of doing your job and working for the people and trying to make things better in the country. And the country and the people are the ones that suffer.
Deval, as a former governor, you look at the dysfunction that many people see in Washington and have a different perspective from the state level, I think. What do you believe is adding to the political divides that we're seeing?
That's the fifth impossible question you've asked. So first, I want to apologize to the people behind me for having my back to them. I think that as a governor, whether you are the sort of governor who works very closely or whether you're one who works very independently of federal government, we need a strong and constructive federal partner. And I think what I've been thinking about and what so many have spoken of already is it turns out that a lot of democracy depends on unwritten rules. You know, rules around decorum and restraint or empathy, duty. All these things we sort of assumed were the guardrails for responsible public service. And there is so much engineering of outcomes by how much money moves in which directions and gerrymandering and so forth. And so as a governor, I think the reaction I have is quite consistent with that expressed by others here and probably felt by everybody participating today, which is enormous frustration that the solving of the nation's problems, whether, again, you believe that government should or should not have a role or how big a role in solving those problems, that there still is an importance in having a functioning government at each level that is responsive and responsible about those unwritten rules.
Let me follow up. What changes or reforms specifically would be at the top of your list in an effort to address a political system that so many Americans feel is just not working?
Starting with me?
Yep.
Well, I do think I think gerrymandering has gotten all out of hand. I mean, this notion that members choose their voters rather than the voters choosing the members, which is and there are a couple of great ideas about how to get at that and create more competitive districts. I think as the caucus in issue 1 has expressed, the transparency that we need in the flow of money it's enormously important, and it ought not be as easily. Look, if I think that contributing to something to try to move the public opinion in a particular way is important, then I ought to be able to say that and stand behind that and be public about that. And I think you ought to know that I'm behind that, and I think we're all hungry for that. So that's at least two things.
What about right underneath you when you're talking, the press has gotten a little, instead of the weather or the sports scores, they run the number of dollars you receive from various lobby groups.
Maybe.
You know, so that you're not going to reveal it yourself, of course.
Maybe.
And so when the Senate Majority Leader gets up to doubt climate change, you print, he received $30 million from the coal industry last month, okay?
Yeah.
Why don't we do that? You could do that.
We've been given the hook, but I would like each one of you, if you could, to address that issue, and then we'll call it an evening.
Reforms?
Yes.
Well, gerrymandering is a big part of it, and I think that's true. I think the changes in the money in politics, how it's done, the transparency that's desperately needed is very important. And again, people who run for office, literally, if they would run as a public servant instead of a politician. You know, I get really disturbed sometimes, and I want young people to get involved, don't get me wrong, in public service and running for office. But sometimes young kids will come to me and say, you know, I want to run for Congress, and they may be 14 years old. This is my lifetime goal. I say, well, why do you want to run? You know, well, I want to be in Congress. I mean, you know, they really, and I say, you really don't want to be there unless you're willing to make the commitment to be a public servant and do the job the way it's supposed to be. If you want to go as the politician, you know, it's wrong. And so many people just look at it as politics. And I think that's a lot of what's been lost, is the fact that it isn't public service in the same way it was quite some time ago.
Well, the National Constitution Center can't endorse specific political reforms, but we do have an exciting national commission in the spirit of Issue 1 called A Madisonian Constitution for All, asking what would Madison think of our current Congress, presidency, courts, and media, and how can we resurrect Madisonian values of thoughtful deliberation and public reason today. It's co-chaired by Senators Chris Coons and Mike Lee. I would love the members and former members who are here to consider becoming involved, and we're going to commission top thought leaders in America, and I'll try to con these guys into doing it as well, to analyze this problem and to propose solutions. I'll just say that, you know, as I started off by saying, I think it all comes down to public education and self-education, which really means it's up to each of us and to all of you. So your homework assignment, now that you've come to the National Constitution Center, is to download the Interactive Constitution, the National Constitution Center's magnificent new app, co-sponsored by the Federalist Society and the American Constitution Society, the leading conservative and progressive lawyers organizations in America. How meaningful it was to bring these two groups together and ask them to nominate the top scholars in America to write about every clause of the Constitution, describing areas of agreement and disagreement. So download it, pick a clause that you don't know about. There are 80 of them. I'm a constitutional law professor. I don't know about most of them. Pick it, read the common statement, which is like a unanimous Supreme Court majority opinion. Read the separate statement, which are areas of disagreement, and then make up your own minds. And then tell your friends about it and tell your kids about it and get into the habit, which is such an incredibly fulfilling lifelong enterprise of lifelong self-education. It's not just a privilege or a luxury, it's a duty, to use that word that has come about today. It is your duty to learn about the Constitution, and I hope that's what you're going to do.
A+ for getting to what you were going to say no matter what.
Thank you so much. Good. Well, and you get one too for downloading the Interactive Constitution.
My reform is personal. I think this is one of the great devices that God has ever given us, or Steve Jobs. Again, he thought he was both. But it's deleterious to what we're talking about. Just because we have the technology to express an opinion instantaneously does not mean we have an opinion worth expressing instantaneously.
Amen. That's right.
And one of the scariest moments I've had in recent years was a United States Senator, whom I suspect everyone in this room knows. I said, is it really that different? I mean, you know, again, you know, Hamilton got killed in New Jersey, for Christ's sake. I mean, how, you know, that was pretty bad, you know. And he pulled out his phone, and he had an alert for every time someone tweeted or posted something about him. So he could read. It was the most un-Republican, lowercase r, thing you could imagine. And so I would just go on a kind of Lenten discipline about social media. This is not about the president. It's really not. I mean, that's a lost cause. But I think the rest of us can maybe learn from this. And proportion matters. You know, your first reaction, sometimes it's right, but oftentimes it's not. And this witless mob mentality that we have about things is, I think, making your jobs or your former jobs a lot more difficult.
We need to end. I'll be very quick. I think we should have a law limiting the length of presidential campaigns to 2 weeks.
I want to thank the panelists.
Why so long?
I thought I was being radical.
Let's give the panelists a hand. Thank you all, panelists, for joining us. Thanks to Issue One for organizing this event with the National Constitution Center. Particular thanks to Ellis and Claire and Meredith and Nick. This was a wonderfully put together. Somebody is coming. Nick is coming with his finger up. Yeah.
We fly back all the way to Nashville from
here. We have two quick other things. Number one, we hope you'll go to our website, issue1.org, and sign up for our Declaration to Renew the Founders' Promise, issue1.org. And then lastly, you guys get treated to another song by the great Mr. Phipps to close it out.
Storm clouds gather far across the sea. Let us pledge allegiance to the land that's free. Let us all be grateful for the land so fair, as we raise our voices in a solemn prayer. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies to the oceans white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
always.